Welcome to sanding and staining the cabinet. This is one of the first in a finishing line of tapes. We're going to be taking a look at methods of sanding and staining a cabinet. You're going to learn a number of things that are very important. First, you're going to learn about the types of abrasives used, sanding techniques, sanding machines that will be used. Then we're going to take a look at staining, types of stains, how to apply the stain, some of the flaws that you might experience, and when you're done with this tape, you'll be ready to apply a finish. As we get into this, I want you to think about one thing. All too often in my experiences in woodworking, we've heard people say, I just can't wait to finish. I'm going to slap on a coat of finish. Well, slapping on a coat of finish it implies that you're really not thinking about what you're doing, that it's an afterthought. And I'd like you to follow along with me during this tape and think about it as a today, a now-oriented thing. We're going to be applying the finish so it is a quality job, so that we've thought about it and we're doing an excellent job. So think in those terms, relax as we go through this tape, and be ready. Take a few notes, get some ideas, and I think you'll enjoy it. One of the first things that you'll have to be thinking about before you do any sanding is the types of abrasives you use. There are a number of types of abrasives that are used in woodworking as elsewhere. I've selected the ones that I like. I'll share with you why I like them and what their purposes are, and from there you can try some of these and see how they work for you. Let me call your attention to some of the ones right here that have either kind of a tan color or a green color, and I show you these because they're the same abrasive, yet they're different colors. It seems weird, but that's the way it is. These are all what we call aluminum oxide, and it's a synthetic abrasive. Aluminum oxides are a very tough synthetic, and that's why they're used for abrasive, because they stay tough. They don't break very easily, which means then that they'll last a long time. But they'll also become dull, and once they become dull, they tend to just ride on the wood and not do any cutting because of that dullness, and there ends the problem. For machine sanding, they're a very good choice, but for hand sanding, I prefer others, and we'll talk about that. Another type of abrasive that's used are what we call the silicon carbide types, and as you look at these, they have the similar colors. There's the gray first, and then a black. Now generally the black ones are waterproof. If you look at the backs of those, they will give you some indication of waterproof. Here it is right there, waterproof abrasive. Well, what this tells us is we can use these wet or dry, and in a lot of finishing applications we use these. Silicon carbide is a very, very sharp abrasive, and it works very well for cleaning off a finish that is between coats. It also is a nice finishing material if you're going to a very fine grit. Now, not always do we go to that fine of a grit. The next one that you see here is our garnet. Garnet generally is an orange color, and the garnets are very good for hand sanding as well as machine sanding, but they are really desirable because they tend to fracture easily, producing new sharp cuts or new sharp edges which will cut the wood. They'll last longer and they'll do a better job. When I do my final sanding in the video, you'll see me use the garnet. I always reach for that. Some of the hand sanding or power sanding might be done with the aluminum oxide or the garnet. Later you may see me touching up some things with the wet dry abrasives or the silicon carbides, as they're also known. Either way, we'll see a number of these things. Now let me call your attention to a couple of other issues. In some cases, sandpaper is that, sandpaper, but in other cases it's a cloth. Here we are with a resin bonded cloth, X weight, X implying a very heavy weight, much like what you'd find on a belt sander. In other cases, we look at it and we'll see a very light paper, what we call an A weight paper. The A on here represents the finest paper. There's A, C, and D. And A is very flexible, it's easy to bend, and if you were going to sand a molding or something, this might be appropriate. But how well do you think this would hold up on an abrasive sander that's moving fast? not nearly as well. And so for that reason, we go from an A weight to a little heavier weight. And let's see what we have here. Here we are. There's the C weight. And the C then tells you a lot harder, tougher paper. It'll withstand that orbiting a lot better. Now, there are some other issues. As you look at this abrasive, this is an 80 weight, and it's a D paper, which is heavier yet. Very good for power sanding, and since it's a coarser abrasive, the lower the number, the coarser it is. And since it is a coarser abrasive, what you're going to find then is you need a little tougher paper because you're usually working a little harder with it. Now, this also says something up here about open coat. An open coat, if you look at it compared to a closed coat, and I think this is a closed coat, you'll notice a difference in the coloring. That's because on the closed coat there's more abrasive per square inch. Here's another one that will give you an idea of what an open coat would look like. These are both 100. This would be open coat and this would be closed coat. For sanding finishes or other gummy materials, the open coat is better because there's more room between the grits to pick up the material that you're trying to remove. So as you look at these, there are some choices that you'll have to be thinking about. Now, there are a few other things that are important here, and I'm going to just demonstrate one of them. In most cases, we're tearing abrasives into a particular size, and I watch people just fold them and have the abrasives just bend off them. One thing that you can do before you do any bending of these is to flex them, and this is a technique I learned years ago, and all you really do is grab it diagonally like so and roll it across that corner of a bench or something. Now you see what's happened to it. Let's see if we can do it the other way now real quickly. You can hear that kind of noise, that tearing noise, and what that's doing, it's loosening up the glue bonds. So now when I go to fold this to make a half sheet, either way, I can bring that over, and I've lined my corner up here. I'll bring this down. You can see that I'm bending. As you look at that edge, I didn't hardly break the abrasive, just one little spot there. That's real good. Now, to tear it, generally what I do is I pinch it real tight, and I try to bring it back on itself, flexing it the other way. And then I try to just pull my fingers across there, make a sharp crease. Once I've done that, it's almost in half. You can see the abrasives are broken nicely. Now I can take a straight edge, put it on that line, and tear it. Now, I hardly lost the abrasive. That's considered a pretty good break. And now, when I use this on the sander, there are very few rough edges here to cause other types of scratching on the surface. So those are some things you can do. That's known as flexing. And depending on the size, you may have to cut this again. So that's a little bit about the abrasives. Now I want to talk about some of the sanding machines that these abrasives are used on. So I'll set these back here for a second and talk about these. All of these come in the same family as you see them on the bench. They're all known as orbital sanders. Orbital sanders turn in an orbit, generally about a 1/16 of an inch diameter swirl. So when they sand, they're sanding with the grain and across the grain, and they leave some scratching. But they work very efficiently. They remove a lot of material, and that's what's nice about them. As we go down this list, the three over here are larger than the three over here. And that's another categorization. We first talk about the size of the orbit, typically 1/16, the number of oscillations per minute, typically 10,000, and then finally the size of the abrasive grit that it holds. Now, let's take a look at this one here. As I flip it up, you'll notice that it's a pretty large sanding area. That's what we call a half sheet sander. It sands exactly 1/2 or uses 1/2 a sheet of abrasive to sand. So when we split that down the middle, the long way, it fits on here perfectly. This one also is a half sheet, and it's got looks like an aluminum oxide abrasive on it. And these are two of the very typical ones for large panels. Now, as you get into tighter areas, this one is called a 1/3 sheet, and it's got a dust collector built in. Notice the holes in the abrasive. Actually, as this runs, there's a slight vacuum that lifts the chips and it comes out through here. So you have to punch the abrasive, and there's a template used to do that. This uses 1/3 of a sheet, so you get 3 out of a sheet of abrasive. As we go over here, we find some of the other finishing sanders that are very common for tighter areas and for general work. Your face frame and that sort of thing might use these. These two are 1/4 sheet, and they use 1/4 of a sheet of abrasive. And in their use, these are probably two of the most common that you see used. I prefer this one because of the grip that you get on it. As you sand, it's not nearly as hard on your wrist as when you sand this way. And so ergonomically, it has a little bit of an advantage. They both work very well, minimal vibration. You'll see some of these used during the videotape today. Now, as you look at this one, this is a 1/6 sheet. That takes 1/6 of a sheet of abrasive. This is a fine little sander in that it gets into tight areas, also ideal for face plates and for the edges of raised panels because it is so small. Usually we machine sand and then hand sand afterward, and you'll see some of these demonstrated as techniques later on. Well, these are some of the sanders that use the typical sheets. We're going to take a look at some other types of abrasive sanding machines. In just a minute, I'm going to have to set those up. So I'll be right back with you and we'll show you those. Well, I put a few more sanders out here on the bench. And I'll pick up, we were talking about orbitals. This is also an orbital sander, and it's a 1/4 sheet, except this one does 15,000 orbits per minute. The difference is, of course, that this isn't electric, this is pneumatic, and I'll just turn it on and give you an idea. Very fast. The nice thing about these is that you move a lot faster so that you get smaller orbits, you remove material quicker. You can use finer abrasives and still remove a lot of material by going with a higher orbit per minute. Many people don't have the air capacity to use something like this, but it's a very fine sander, and for finish work it's one of the best that I've found. Now, I also have another line sander, it's called, and line implying that it's straight line. It too runs at about 15,000 straight line movements. So this will not go against the grain, but will always be going with the grain. This is a little bit different approach, and it uses a much smaller abrasive. For finish work and for trim work and getting inside a cabinet, this is real nice, and I think you'll see that it uses about 1/8 of a sheet, about half of the 1/4 sheet's size. Now, this one has a switch back here. When I pull it or push it, the movement is so little that you may not be able to see it here. But it removes a lot of material in a straight line. So after you did all the orbital work, you could go with the straight line sander and take the marks out, or you could hand sand and do just the same thing. But those are a couple types of air type sanders. I like these because nobody can borrow them. Nobody has enough air pressure to use them. You know the 3 policies on tools: 1, don't lend them; 2, don't lend them; 3, don't lend them. All right, let's take a look at a couple more here. These are known as random orbits, and the difference with these is that they orbit randomly. They don't have a perfect circle, but they tend to make a random type of orbit, and so their scratch pattern's a little different, and when you use very fine abrasives, you don't even see the scratch pattern. Both of these have dust collectors on them, and you can see there are holes in the abrasives. The nice thing about these is they're Velcro oriented, so that you can go from one abrasive size to the next very easily, and there is no problem with changing those, and the stickum types would be wasted. In this case, you could use them a couple times, or let's say you want to sand through a sequence of abrasives, you could do that easily. Now, this is a variable speed, this is a single speed. These remove stock very aggressively and generally might be used on the interim. You might go from a belt sander to these, then to the orbital, and then to hand sanding. And so you'll find these are very commonly used. One other nice feature is many of these have a hand pad like this with a Velcro on it, so that if you want to hand sand now, you have a nice pad that you can use to do exactly the same thing. And this is nothing but a Velcro, and it's spongy, and you can get these in various types of hardness. So that's another approach that can be used. Now, finally, one of the most aggressive of all sanders is the belt sander. And I prefer the 3x21, meaning that we use a belt 3 inches wide, 21 inches long. And the reason I prefer those is it's about all I can handle and manage easily. Now, these use a cloth-backed abrasive, and in most cases they have a pad here that's some kind of very heat-resistant material. Notice the pad comes over this way, so I can adjust the belt so that it comes over to this outer edge, and I can sand parallel. Now, this is a very aggressive sander. It removes material very quickly, And so in this case, you're going to be using it for removing mill marks. You might remember in VW308 building the cabinet, I actually used this to remove mill marks in surface preparation. So you might refer to that. We may see it used a few times here too. All right, so these are some of the types of sanders that will be used. Belts usually are your first step, removing the mill marks, random orbits, and then to an orbital sander, and then finally hand sanding or straight line sanding of one sort or another. So there are a number of types of sanding that need to be done. Well, we learned a little bit about the sanders, sanding materials, sandpapers, if you will. And so I think we're ready to do some sanding. I'm going to bring in some cabinets here, and we'll do some sanding, and I'll demonstrate some of the techniques. So I'll be back with that setup in just a minute. I've just about wrapped up the orbital sanding with the 1/6 sheet sander on this door. This is an upper door and it'll have a glass panel in it. The lower door behind me is there with the raised panel stained inside of it. The moldings match up. As you do a door like this, you notice how nicely this 1/6 sheet sander covers the nice flat areas and does a beautiful job on those. It's got 100 grit on it, and now there are some things that we have to devote some attention to with hand sanding. And some of the simple things that we'll do will be to first try to clean up any marks we have at the corners. We don't want to sand across this and put scratches across that grain, so we tend to just stop right there and work our way back to that other line, like so. Now we'll do that all over the door, and then we'll come this way, like so. In other words, we want to just come right up to that line, but we don't want to cross it. Any cross-grain scratching shows up dramatically with staining, especially certain types of stain. Some other things we have to pay attention to are the miters inside the doors. You can see that now. The way these were coped together, they line up pretty nicely, but we want to sand those. If they don't line up perfectly, we can encourage that alignment with a little abrasive work. And I'm using an A-weight paper, so it tends to conform to the arc of that molding. And chances are you haven't power sanded there anyway. Depending on how sharp your cutters were on your shaper or router will impact on how much sanding needs to be done here. If the cutters are dull, it's a good idea to have them sharpened so that you don't spend a lot of time sanding. Now, these are a couple of the hand techniques. Also on the outer edge of the door, you can see we've got a shoulder here. That shoulder should be the same height here as it is here. If there's a little twisting in the way the door was shaped or routed, that may not be the case, so you may want to encourage that a little bit. And again, you'll have a miter line at that corner, and that miter line should extend from that corner to the corner of the door. And once again, you can kind of cheat that. If you need to, you can be creative. Well, I haven't finished this side, but I'll do that later on my own. I wanted you to see those techniques. Now I want to flip the door over and call your attention to a couple of other things. First of all, while I've got it up like this, you can see it's already been hinged. I wouldn't want to do the final sanding until after it's been fitted to the door. It's just not a good practice. If your hands are dirty, you're just setting yourself up for more sanding work. The other thing that's important here is notice that I've taken an awl and with a series of dots I've put LL. That's the lower left corner of that door. And so now after I stain over that, those dots will be there. You say, well, that's visible. Not really, because the hinge that goes there will cover that, and that's a way that I can always tell where this door belongs, and it's one of the code techniques I like to use. Also, while it's up here, can you notice this rabbet through here, this L-shaped channel? This is where the glass will be contained. Now, interestingly enough, you have to pay a lot of attention to that rabbet as well, because if you think in terms of this door, if I look through the glass, I can see the back of that rabbet. So what a lot of people don't think about is their finishing techniques have to be as good on the back or inside of that door where the rabbet is as it would be anywhere on the door, because this has to be stained carefully and it has to look nice. And later we'll take a look at some of the staining techniques here so you'll see what happens. But I'm going to sand that rabbet up very carefully, and then I'm also going to watch the backs of these along this end grain. It's a little coarser where the router or shaper cut it. I can feel a little roughness. I'll clean that up.
You say, well, I am going across the grain here. I am, but on this end grain, it'd be just about impossible to do it any other way. Because it is end grain, I may want to come back with a little finer abrasive here. I'm at 120 now. I might want to go to 150 or 180 just on that end grain so it doesn't take the pigments as deeply or the penetration as deeply in the case of a penetrating stain. We'll talk more about the stain techniques in a bit. Now remember, that rabbet has to be done nicely so that it will showcase the glass well. Another thing you don't think about is, imagine this door having a mirror in it. If I were to look in the glass of the mirror, it would reflect the back side of the rabbet. So even if you're putting a mirror in here, you'll find that it's very important that you pay attention to that technique. Let's take a look now at a couple of other things. First, I've got a raised panel here. This is a little softer piece of wood. This is cottonwood, and I'm going to just sand the face up. Now I ended going with the grain, and since it's orbital, there's still some scratching. I can now sand with the grain, and some people would say it's better to block sand, that is, put a block of wood behind here. Well, that's true if this is a perfectly flat panel, but for light hand sanding, I choose to do it this way so it follows any irregularities of the door. Now, on some raised panels, you have a flat, which is easier to sand, but this is an arc piece, so once again, that A-weight paper is a good choice, and I can go along that way, and then I can go the opposite way, being careful not to ride up on that shoulder along there. If I start to roll those edges over, I lose the detail in the door, so I'm very careful of that, and that's part of why I only sand that with a finer abrasive, so that's not a problem. At the top of this crown, and at the bottom where we have this straight, we have what we call end grain. And sanding that, again, is difficult, especially in a curve like this. I'm going to have to sand across the grain here. It's very difficult to end up sanding with the grain, but I do want to sand it. And right now, I'm at 120. I will probably take this end grain up to 150 using the same techniques you see here. And the reason I'll go to the 150 is I want less stain penetration, and by going with a finer abrasive on the end grain, that'll be the case. Again, you can see this miter that follows across here and down here. As I continue sanding, I'll wear away more material here. I may have to come over here and touch that up to encourage that miter to go out to the corner, and that's one of the indicators that you can use as a guideline. So I'm by no means done with this. I just want to show you the technique here so that you can see how that's done. Now, in some cases, you'll notice that I stained the panel before I put it in. That's probably the best practice, because if there is any stain problem, you can cure it before the door is assembled. Now when I go to stain this again, it won't matter if a little stain spills over on here because it's a pigmenting stain and it generally doesn't take any more, and I can wipe it to smooth it out. So I'm real happy with what I have here, and also if that panel shrinks, I won't see a white line along here because it's already been stained. Now this door has already been prepared. I did not stain the panel, and I'm going to be using a water-based stain that will kind of roll in here, but it is the best practice whenever possible to go ahead and stain the panel first. At the time I did this, I wasn't quite sure of color, so I didn't do it, but it is the best practice. As I feel this molding along here, I can feel just a little bump with my hand, and I'll come back with a fresh piece of abrasive and I'll fold this and I'll bring it along here to kind of take that mark out of there, or that feeling of a bump. And it may be that I'll position this so that's the bottom of the door so it won't be as visible. I lucked out the other side's a little better. And it's a good idea to look these things over to make sure you can do those things. So a little planning goes a long way early on. That's a little bit about panel raised work, and there's some thinking that needs to go into that. I also want to talk about some other details. This is the top of a little nightstand, and notice we have a piece of plywood wrapped with 3 pieces of solid stock. Just as when we had that face frame come together at a right angle, we now have these coming together at a miter, and so when we do our hand sanding here, we'll want to bring that up to that point like so, and then come the other way again, so we don't have any cross-grain scratching. The plywood in the center will have to be sanded with the grain, and we'll just have to bring our line up imaginary, like so, to that edge in a hand sanding fashion. And again, this is 120. Sometimes we go finer, but typically I don't sand that fine. One question that's often asked is, how do I know when I'm done sanding? And it's a good question. Typically with oak, if you want good stain penetration, 120, 150 maybe, even 100, depending on how much stain penetration you want. And we'll see some differences as we go today. But that's a good question to ask. With softer wood, such as a poplar or cottonwood, willow, you may want to sand a little finer because they have more stain absorption with dyes, and those are some things to look at. Well, I see this is pretty clean. There are no mill marks, and mill marks are the waves that are caused by machines, and we talked about that in 101. One of the first things you want to do is remove those. I've got a little keyway in here that will take on a little extra stain because of the end grain orientation, and we'll probably take a look at that when we go through. Also, check those edges. I can feel just a little bit of a rough edge, a little sharp corner. I want to break that off now so I don't have any problems. And look for those sharp corners on all your parts. Break those off as you go so that they won't cause a problem either with a sliver later or with some kind of finishing problem as you go to rub them out. It could grab the rag, tend to cause some additional problems later on. So look for those things. Always check your moldings, make sure they're right, and always keep in mind that you want to go with the grain whenever possible. It isn't always possible, but it is something we try to do. Larger panels such as this, and the backs of other cabinets will be larger than this, we can go with a quarter or half sheet sander, and most of your plywood comes sanded very well, but I tend to clean it off, especially if it's been around the shop a while, absorbed a little moisture, which can happen. So I like to sand it, and generally I start at 100 to 120 grit on it because it is sanded very smooth. You also have to be careful with plywood. If you sand too much, you can sand through that top veneer. Not a good practice, something you won't be happy about because it's not going to take stain well. Also, let's suppose we didn't go all the way through the veneer, but sanded pretty deep. We get very close to the glue line, and that spot will not take stain as well as the others. It will show up as a lighter area generally. So we'll just coarsely go over this. And as smooth as this is, I would probably get a block of wood and block sand that to smooth it up. Now there's one final area that's important, and that is the issue of drawers. Some people assemble their drawers first, others like to do it like so. What I've done here is I've stained the front already, and I wanted to show you why. As I put these two parts together, how does my dovetail show up? A lot better than if I'd smeared the stain on here at the end, would it not be? You spend all that energy doing a half-blind dovetail. It's just good practice to say to yourself, well, why can't I sand all of these parts, and indeed they are, sand all the insides early so that they can be sealed, and then you can assemble your drawer. It may take you a little more time in fitting after the fact, but to me, after you put all this energy into making a beautiful dovetail, you want to show it off, and that's important to me. Well, I'm going to step over to this cabinet and do some hand sanding on it, point out some other details there, and I'll meet you over there in just a minute. I've just about finished the block sanding of all of the plywood, and I've got a nice block. We talked about block sanding earlier, but this has little pins here that will grab the abrasive and hold it so that it won't move much. And you can set it up nice and tight. It's easy on, easy off. There are a number of styles like this, but the point is it's a relatively hard material. It flexes a little bit and it removes material nicely. Now, I've checked all this out. I've looked at my miters. My miters are nice and tight. Everything's clean, except I've got two circles here, very lightly penciled in. Or I've noticed got a couple flaws in the wood, and I want to fill those with a little plastic wood filler to later sand those off and level them off. Try to hide those imperfections as best possible. So what I've chosen to do is use a plastic wood, and I'll just take a little bit of it on a stick, scrap of wood, and I keep it covered. It's very important to keep those covered because they tend to harden very quickly. There are specific solvents used for these, and you may want to make sure that you have some available if you're going to use this much. Generally, I put it on with my finger. You can wet your finger and it won't stick nearly as much. I've got two spots here. This one is not very deep, so I always mound it up a little bit, and you can see it there, it's mounded. This one is also fairly shallow, but it will shrink a little bit, so I'd sooner put a little too much on, but I don't want to get it in those moldings if I can avoid it. That's pretty good. And I'm just going to take my thumbnail and knock that out of the molding. Sometimes your lighting can have an impact. If you stand in one spot, it's not as visible as others. So you may want to look it over before you apply this, pat it down a little bit, and then leave it alone. That's probably the best advice I can give you. Well, we filled these with a plastic wood type wood filler, and there are a number of other materials, and while this is curing, I thought I'd just direct your attention to a few of these. So let's step over to the bench for a minute. This is a lacquer base, kind of a nitrocellulose material. It's a plastic wood, it's often referred to as. These people call it wood repair. There are various brands. Some of these come in colors. As you look at these, cherry, dark mahogany, walnut, each one of these has a shade of its own. And you can match these to the color of the wood or the color of the finish or somewhere in between. This particular brand takes stain reasonably well. Others don't take it very well at all, and so they're going to call attention to themselves. You may want to go with a darker one. So in other words, you'd actually fill to the finish color of the wood rather than filling to the color of the wood in its raw state. Another material that's sometimes used is a water putty, which is like a gypsum-based material. And it's nothing but a powder that you mix with water. It doesn't take stain. I use it a lot in the shop for the purpose of leveling a surface before applying, say, a plastic laminate or something of that nature. But it's really not a very good choice if you're going to go with a stain or a finish because it won't take the finish very well. One other material that really works nicely for finishing is what we call stick shellacs. And there are a number of colors of these, from or lack of color, a clear to almost a jet black as you look at some of these, a little layer of dust on them. But I think you get the idea. There are a number of colors. These can be used to repair finished pieces. Say you've got a ding in your dining room table and it's got to be patched. A spot finisher will use these, but we can also use these to fill holes in wood. Now, what we do is we match the colors to the finished color of the wood. And so what I've done is I've set out a piece of wood here, and I've got a few pieces of the stick shellac, various numbered pieces that tend to match various parts of the piece of wood. And I show you that because as you look at various places on that piece of wood, there's going to be different colors. So you won't say that one size or one color fits all. When you look at a piece of wood, there are a number of colors as it's stained. So you have to be tuned into that. And these are used with a knife like this. This is a heater. It heats the knife, and this is scooped off and then drug across the opening until it levels off. Usually you need at least two of these knives so you can have one heating while you're using the other to keep them hot enough to work. They can then be sanded smooth with a surface, and you would probably apply them to a raw wood and then stain afterwards. These will not take any stain. So that's the dilemma with them. You select the color of the wood and try to match it as best you can. And it's a little bit of a guess. Everything I've shown you so far is before the fact. That is, you fill the hole before the finishing. Let's take a look at after the fact. This is a type of wood material that's like a putty or a clay base, and it will harden somewhat, and it can be inserted into the wood after the finish has been applied. In other words, we'll put the finish on and then we'll apply this to the holes after the fact. It's like a wax. You can wipe it off and buff it out. There are other devices called fill sticks, which look a lot like a crayon, and they're in various colors of wood, and you can drag them into the opening and they will fill in. They're nice and hard, so it's a very hard wax. Once it's smeared in and buffed off, it finishes up and you can match the color. If there's nails, holes in various places, you can pick one that matches the wood, much like the stick shellac. So there are Crayola-like fill sticks. Various manufacturers of finishing materials make these available. Sometimes they have an assortment. They call it an oak assortment or a walnut assortment. It just depends. Look through the catalogs that are available to you and they will help you. Another after the fact is what we call a plug. And this is a button type plug. That is, I finished these on this board. I glued them lightly on, and you can see where the stain was around there, and then I brushed on the finish. I then break them off, and they've got a little rabbet around the back, so they will fill a hole, in this case a 3/8 hole, and call attention to themselves because there'll be a button on the top. The button part that you have here actually is decorative in nature, and so you may find that that's a filling device that you'll have to cover a screw hole that maybe you need access to later. You can break these out. The glue joints on here are fairly stiff. I can tap them, usually sideways, and break those off like so. Well, those are a few of the types of fill devices. There are also what we call plugs, and plugs will fill the holes as well, only they'll be level with the surface. Well, that's a pretty good idea of the materials used to fill holes. Let's take a look now at some types of stain, and I'll get those out now. I've set out a number of stains, and I thought I'd start out here and give you a little historical perspective and walk you down through some of the changes in wood finishing and staining materials. First of all, some of the original stains came from materials such as tobacco, beet juice. Often stains were made from organic materials, but as time went on they found that they faded and they didn't hold their color. So some actual chemical stains were made up, and this is a dye-based stain, and if you look at the label it says water soluble. Some stains would be water soluble, others will be soluble in alcohol and other types of glycols. And oil as well. So there's a number of different vehicles that they float in, but once they evaporate off, the dye remains. Dyes, much like the clothing dyes, RIT dye that you might use for clothing, penetrate into the wood. And in fact, I've used regular clothing dyes to stain woods colors like green in the past. They're available in a powder form like you see here, and they're also available in a mixed form. This happens to be a penetrating oil stain, which means the vehicle is oil. Now, one of the things about the penetrating stains is they're a dye and the color in the wood is uniform, and it doesn't tend to highlight the grain as much. That can vary from one job to the next. On this particular panel, we use the same stain on both sides, a penetrating oil stain, but you notice it's lighter over here than it is here. What's happened is we sanded this much finer, probably about 40 grit finer than it is on this side, so you get that contrast in color. And again, if you're selecting a stain, surface preparation of the wood is a very important part. Some friends of mine who build staircases send everything out sanded to 80 grit. So the finisher knows that everything is uniform in abrasive grit. However, that doesn't account for end grain and other things, and he may want to do some test work before he actually finishes the staircase. The stain you see here is what we call a golden oak, and it's a water-based product. Now this has both dyes and pigments in it, and it tends to sit on the wood a little bit and also go in and color the wood. The colorant you see here is that. It tends to raise the wood a little bit, raise the grain of the wood a little bit because of the moisture in it. That's not the case with oil, but I have yet to find that to be a problem. Now notice that there is a little bit of contrast in the wood, and the reason for that is on this side you'll notice that this is actually two separate boards, one darker than the other. And when we put the stain on, you'll notice that the color tends to become a little more uniform. This was done with the golden oak you see here, and this was done with the fruit wood pigmenting stain here. And they're about the same in the way they color the wood, and it depends on what you want to work with. The water-based are very nice because cleanup of your brushes and everything is water-based unless the material cures. The beauty of this is environmentally it's very sound, and I think eventually we'll find most of the products going to the water base. Some of the older technology is the pigment base that you see here, and both of these were stained with pigment stains. Now, the thing about pigment stains is they tend to ride on the surface. Rather than a dye that penetrates the wood, there are pigments in suspension in here. So these must be constantly stirred, just like a paint. If not, the pigments tend to drop out. And interestingly enough, I've had some students in the past, one decided that he was going to finish a particular bedroom set with a color of stain. He never stirred the stain, and he started with a very light color, and as he continued staining the parts, every part got darker because as he got deeper in the can, the pigment concentration got greater. Very important that you stir these frequently during the application. They are then wiped off, and you'll see that demonstrated later. But pigment-based stains take a little longer to dry, and there's also a compatibility issue. Are they compatible with the top coats? The same holds true with the waters and other things. Generally, the instructions that come with that will give you all of the finer points of that, and you'll want to check that out. Now, there is another style of pigment stain that's a little bit different, and I wanted to show you this because it's very important. It doesn't come out of the can unless you invite it out, so to speak. It has the consistency of a grease almost, and so the pigments are held in suspension. It's a gel. And when you apply this, it gives you a more uniform color generally, and you'll find that it's much more manageable. Everything else is almost a water consistency. Now, I use this stain to stain the front of this drawer and also stain the dovetails. This drawer was glued up, and then I stained it. Interestingly enough, I was able to follow the outline of the dovetails. That would have been virtually impossible with any of the other stains on the bench. So there are some benefits in certain applications where you may find this stain has some unique features. Well, you're going to see 3 different stains used today. We're going to talk about the water-based, this pigmenting, as well as the gelled pigmenting, so you get an idea of how they're applied and what some of their features are. You'll see me go through the steps, and maybe it'll help you understand how they work and maybe better choose what you want to use on your piece. So you'll notice that. Now, I want to show you one last thing here. And if you look at this piece of wood, down here at the bottom, you probably still see some lines going across. And you've heard me talk about mill marks many times. No attention was paid to the mill marks down here. They weren't sanded away. And now after the stain and finish have been applied, they look almost like washboard lines on there. It's very important that all of the preparation be done beforehand. Otherwise, when you see them on the staining job, you're going to have to go back and sand again or live with them. A lot of people live with them, but everybody who knows woodworking will be the first to point them out to you. So you'll want to make sure that you do as much in your surface preparation up front as you possibly can. Well, that's the fundamentals of the types of stains. I'm going to set the bench up, get out some papers, get an apron and so forth, and I'll be ready to apply some stain in a minute. I'll meet you back here then. Well, I'm about ready to do some staining. I've got the pigment wiping stain, and I poured some off neatly into this container, and I've stirred it real well. I like to work out of a container with just a small amount in it. That way, anything that's wasted I can discard because I don't like the contaminants to go back in the can. What kind of contaminants might there be? Well, let's take a look. One of the first things I do before I stain anything is wipe it with a tack cloth. And a tack cloth is just kind of a tacky piece. You can buy these at almost any hardware store. And it removes any dust on the piece before you do any staining. And I think you get an idea of what kind of debris there can be. We'll get both sides of this. And again, remember that rabbit we talked about? We'll pay special attention to removing the debris in there because that has to be finished as well. Now, these are about the size of a quarter sheet of abrasive, and you can unfold them and fold them various ways to use all of the surfaces in here. And you'll see as time goes on that they load up pretty quickly. I'll set this off for a second. It's been tacked, it's ready. And then I have the lower door, and I've stained the inside panel. And you can see there is quite a bit of dust from sanding the other parts in there. So let's see if we can pick up most of that. The moldings nicely. We'll do the rest of the door. that over. This is ready to stain as well. Now, a few things that are very important is how you protect yourself. Obviously, put on an apron. A lot of times to protect your hands, one of the things you can do is take some of these waterless type of hand cleaners and just put these on. You can see I've got a little bit of stain on my hands already. But I'll put this on actually before I do any staining. And what this does, it puts a little barrier between your skin and the stain, so later when you do wash up, and this will air dry, you can then just wash your hands and you'll be amazed at how much easier it comes off. If you get too much on, you can just pat them a little bit. Now, for this particular application, I'll be wearing some rubber gloves, so I've got 2 layers of protection, belt and suspenders. Safe woodworking, I guess you'd call this. At any rate, I'm ready to go now. I've got some rags out here that I can use to wipe the stains after the fact. And you notice the panel has been stained. I don't know how well they'll show up. I'll hold it down in the light. Maybe we can get it. There are some mill marks across this area of the panel. The panel is just a little thin, so we have some. They're chosen to be on the back side, and this is one of the types of flaws that can occur, and I just show that to you now. I'll do the back side of the door, and then I'll do the front. Now, in order to do both sides, what I've prepared are these little devices. They're about a 1/2-inch dowel with a nail in the top that's been sharpened. In other words, I drove the nail and cut the head off and ground a point on it. This is a piece of 3/4-inch particle board about 3 by 3. What this will allow me to do is I'll set 4 of these down here at the end of the bench, and I can flip this over and then stain the other side. So this allows me to get both sides done in one pass. Now, it'll leave 3 little points. If I was careful, I could put them right here where the hinge holes were, but they don't make much of a mark on the piece, and since they'll be on the back of the door, I'm not nearly as concerned about that. All right, so I've got my stain stirred nicely, and I've got a brush here that I used earlier. I cleaned it out. Always a question about the brush. You don't need a very expensive brush for applying stain, because after the fact you'll be applying the finish. As long as the bristles are in tight, you can use these. You'll see a foam brush used later to do the water stain, but again, this is an oil-based pigmenting stain. When I work with this, I don't want to load the brush too much, but I do want to make sure that I can get all of the edges nicely sealed, and I'll wet the outer area, and when the brush starts to dry out, I'll work inward. Now, the brush is drying a little bit. I'll work that rabbit in there because I want to make sure I cover that. I don't want any white showing. And if I get a little on the panel that's already been stained, it's really of no consequence because it's a pigment stain. It sits on the surface. It's really not going to make it any darker. I'll just tap this side of the can so I don't get too much on there. And let's work this area. Okay, I've got the flats, and I'll do the edges in a minute, but let's take a rag and wipe some of this before it starts to set up. It may look like it's darker in here, but that's because that stain is wet. As it dries, it'll look the same as the rest. The marks that are up here, I can just kind of wash those out by wetting it a little bit and then spreading that out. There. Okay, now let's do the edges there that are shaped. And again, I've overlapped on the top, but that's really not much of a problem. you can use the rag quite a while and flip it around and just use various surfaces until you use it all up. This is oil-based, so you have to pay some attention to discarding the rags because they could be a spontaneous combustion fire hazard. So factor that into the disposal. Make sure they dry out and they can't accumulate heat. That's generally the problem that occurs. Now I've set these up and they're going to sit on the panel like so. And so now there are 4 points that panel's on. I'm going to have to kind of go easy as I stain it, but this is going to enable me to stain both sides. And clean up those edges. The staining of this side is going to go identical to the staining of the opposite side. So I'll finish this up and get the other doors ready. The glass door that you saw behind me has a rabbit. I'm going to have to pay special attention to that. And so keep that in mind. I'm going to finish staining these, and once this is done I'm going to set up for water staining on another piece, and we'll show you some other techniques. So you're probably getting tired of watching me do this. You probably don't want to watch the stain dry, so I'll see you in a bit. I've got some water-based stain out here now in another cabinet that I thought I would stain with that. I thought I'd go through the steps and give you a little idea. You may not notice this, but this is actually off the bench about 1/4 inch so that nothing will stick to it. I can always pull that paper away after the staining's been done. To begin this, I'm going to first sweep off all the moldings rather than use a tack cloth because there's quite a bit of material that accumulates on here. And I thought I would just sweep it off first and then use the tack cloth on it. That way I can economize on the tack cloth. Now I mentioned earlier that water-based stains have a tendency to raise the grain, and when I sanded this door for staining, I sanded it to the same level as this. And I want you to listen very carefully. That gives you an idea what's happened. That grain has come up a little bit. And I can put some sanding sealer on that and sand it off, and we'll demonstrate that later. But for now I thought I'd share that with you, that there is some grain raising. Now some people will wet the surface first to raise the grain, then sand it and apply the stain to minimize that. I don't find it that objectionable, and I'm going to go with it as is. But if you did have that problem, that would be the step you would use. You would raise the grain lightly with a very lightly dampened sponge. Once the wood fiber is dried, and you should wait a couple hours at least, you'd sand it lightly again and then proceed to stain. We're going to just roll the dice here and do it this way. I'm just pleased with it the way it is, so I'm going to go that route. Now the next thing I want to do is take my tack cloth to it again, and I folded this to another clean surface, but you can already see that I'm starting to accumulate some of that debris. The more of that I remove now, the less sanding I'll have to do later. So we'll get that all cleaned off. The other side. And then I'll get the inside. Now I probably won't stain all the way up the inside. I'll come up over beyond where the drawer will be, and then I'll stop simply because that won't be visible once the drawer's in and the cabinet is finished. Wow, you can see that I've really picked up a lot of material even after brushing. I think this comes to show you how important it is to actually follow this step and use that tack cloth. Well, let me set the stain off and set the tack cloth off. I'm done with those. Put my staining gloves back on here. And I'm going to be using a little bit different brush, and that's a foam pad brush. Foam works very well with water-based stains, and I poured off some into this plastic container here, and I've stirred it well. I stirred actually the quart container first, but it's good to have that stir around. Remember, what I said about any pigments. This is pigment and dye, but it's a good idea to do that. Now with a water stain, you're going to find that it goes further quicker, so you don't want to have too much in the brush, and you want to keep your movement smooth. You won't be able to see this first one or two, but bear with me, you'll see it in a minute. You work from wet to dry, and I've got a nice light source between me and the workpiece so I can see any skips or holidays, as they're called. That is, places where maybe the stain was applied too lightly. And I don't want the stain to pool or puddle anywhere, because if it does, what will happen is there may be some lap streaks which look kind of funny. That is, it looks darker in one spot. So we start to work it best we can. Get this inside edge. And I'll bring it out of that corner this way. Now, the question you may be asking is, do you wipe this stain? Well, I've never had to wipe it because, again, it's a dye. It tends to go into the wood mostly, and I've never had that problem. Now, some people will wipe it, but I never put it on that thick. You can spray this stain as well, and then you can put it on even thinner so you can build up. Because it is a dye, you can ease up to the color you want. But for what I'm doing, this foam brush works well. Many of you who are watching at home don't have the luxury of a spray system in your two-car garage or wherever you're working. So this, I think, is an appropriate way to show you. The control that you have is very good. One of the other things people talk about is there's a tendency for some water-based finishes to bubble with these foam brushes. If you jab and poke the brush, that's true, but if you take long strokes, you won't have that problem. You can see that this works very nicely. You can drag it a long ways. You just got to watch your accumulation in corners. And as it dries, you'll see some color change. I'm getting a nice uniform color on, and that's an interesting thing too, because solid woods and plywood, sometimes because of their grain orientations, do not stain up the same. And we'll take a look in a minute. We'll do a side, and then you can see what happens there as far as colors on solid woods and plywoods adjacent to each other. All right, now I'm going to come down to this side, and we'll take a look at staining this edge, or this end I should say. And I'm going to just start up the top, let gravity do its thing. Bring this down, keep those marks nice and even. And the moldings I got to pay a little attention to, because there's all those curves and we want to address that. Now you can see where I've come up here. I want to pull that away. I don't want to leave that mark, because if I do, I may end up with some overlap and a difference in color. So I'll just work that a little bit. Back up here, blend this in. And I'm going to take another minute or two here to show you a little more, and then I'll wrap it up. and we'll go on to something else, but I want you to see these moldings and some of the things that are going on here. See, as I come back here, I leave a line right there, and I want to pull that, thin it out as quickly as possible so it blends nicely. If I were to leave that and focus on the moldings, I'd be setting myself up for some markings. So I want to blend that, and then I can come back to the moldings, drag this through, pick it up, drag it through, and pick this up. I think you'll agree, color-wise, we're starting to see a good match. We're seeing some drying here, so it won't be as uniform, but later when it's finished, you'll see what it looks like, and that may be helpful to you, envisioning the entire package. Okay. Well, you may have noticed I've got my hands full here. I'm going to continue staining this because I don't want to stop in the middle and get any lap marks. But when you see me again, we'll be taking a look at the gelled wood stains and show you some techniques with those. So I'll see you back here on another job. But for now, I'm going to have a ball here staining. See you later. We're going to be using the gelled wood stain now, and you might recall that its neatest feature was that it's a gel-like material and that it won't flow out. There's a lot of places that can be beneficial. The stain stays uniform in the can, as we said earlier, so we're not going to have any differentiation of color as we go deeper in the can, and there's no stirring. I can work out of the can, and that's probably the easiest with the gelled. Contamination isn't as big a problem. I brushed them and I wiped them down already with my tack cloth, so I'm ready to do some staining. And I thought what I would do as the first thing is show you that dovetailing and staining that, because this is an important treatment. It's my belief that once you put all that energy into making something like a dovetail, you want to showcase it rather than hide it. So we'll first attempt that and see how steady my hand is today, and then we'll go on to the cabinet and show you some staining techniques there. This stain does require some wiping, and I've got a rag. It's again oil-based, so you want to make sure that you make provisions for disposing of the rags safely. You don't want heat to build up, and one of the best ways is to lay them out flat someplace so that they will dry out, not touching any others near a non-flammable. On a concrete or over a metal garbage can is a good choice. Another way is to put them in a sealed container designed specifically for that. I'm going to just get a little bit on the tip of the foam applicator, and that's what I've chosen for this. It really is more, you can almost use a squeegee for this. It doesn't really matter that much. And I'm going to just, on this one, the half-blind dovetails are slightly recessed, so I've actually got a little bit of a benefit there that I can really move with it. I slipped a little bit, but maybe I can hide that. Okay, I've got just one little spot between the top dovetail there. I'm going to just see if I can draw that back. There's just a little bit of coloring there. I mean, it almost looks like a burn mark in the wood. I'm going to leave that for now, and I may come back and treat that. We'll just see how it goes. I'm going to rub this out a little bit. So I don't want the pigments laying on the surface. Again, this is a pigment stain. And that came out pretty well. I'm going to do the other end now, and I'll just set it on this block of wood while I do that. And I don't have much on the applicator, and that's good. I don't really want to be spilling it all over. I'd sooner have to overbrush it a little bit. Not bad. Okay. Now, the next question that often comes up is where do you stop on the drawer? If I stain inside, I'm liable to make a mess. So I'm going to just drag it across the top and the bottom, and then I'll do the front. And once again, I don't want too much on my applicator. Okay. I prefer this approach because it tends to mark a clear line, and when you put this in the drawer opening, there's not a white shadow that can show through, so it works pretty well. I don't think you could do this with any of the other types of stains because they are so thin that they would flow out and make this difficult. But if you had a lot of drawers and this was one of the things you wanted to do, this indeed would be the material to choose. Now let's see if I can lay it on this like so. There we go. Very easy to work with, almost reminiscent of paint, except it's more forgiving because you can just rub it out anytime you want. Okay, so now let's wipe that off a little bit. I got just a little on there. Get that off. All right, now we'll flip it up and we can do the upper portion here. Alright, now it's a matter of rubbing this out. Being careful, I want to make sure I don't have any on my gloves as well because I could make a mess out of the sides that way. And again, if this were a thinner stain, I think you'd agree that that would be a problem. But let's have a look. Looks pretty good. I see just a little bit of stain rolled over up here. Let's take a look at the bottom once again. That's good. We got a nice line there. We can really see that color difference. And that's what my objective was. I'm real pleased with that. All right, let's go along here now. I'm going to do the outside where you can get a good view of it. Time's running a little short, so I want to make sure that you get the idea. Again, I'm going to start at the top on this little nightstand, and I can work with or across the grain. And lap marks aren't as big a problem here because the pigments are slow to dry, and you can overlap and rub them out. The wiping portion with the rag actually will help you make them look better. So rub them out as we go. I'll come down to the moldings and then I'll stop. One of the things you may be noticing here, even with the lap joints that are coming through, the color is nice and uniform, and it does have a nice hiding capability, a little more so than the dye type stains because they tend to soak into the wood, and they don't soak into the wood fillers and plastic woods nearly as well as a pigment stain lays on top of it. So let's rub this out and then do the base molding. Must be my lunch coming. Now I'll pay some attention to the back of this molding too, because as it sits against the wall, I don't want any white reflection back there. And I'll just touch that up lightly. And then I got to pay some attention to this molded area, because with those shapes we're going to have a little bit of accumulation of pigment. So I'll hook my thumbnail in there and just pull it along that line both times to clean that out. We don't want the pigment accumulating in there. As we start to apply a finish, we may find it picking up if that's the case. So this gives you an idea of what it ought to look like. It's rubbed out, the color's nice, the moldings look good, and that's more or less what I was after. Well, I'm going to go ahead and work on the front now, and I'm sure you've got the idea of what the gelled wood stains are like, so when you get tired of watching, you'll pull out, I'm sure, but I'm going to stay busy here. Well, I got most of my pieces stained. It seems like a long time, but I want to show you a few things about them that have occurred, help you understand a little bit about the behaviors of wood, and kind of relate it to surface preparation. I think that'll be an important part of our exercise today. Let me first direct you to this panel here, and I want you to look at the center. You see how much lighter it is. The wood here is actually quarter sawn wood, and it took the stain differently than the edges. And there's really not much I can do about it except maybe apply a glaze stain over it to match it up. But then I should probably glaze the other panel on the opposite or mating door. So I may just decide to live with this, but there are some things I can do with it. This really I don't think of as much a flaw as I do a problem with the wood matchup, and that might be something else you want to think about as you go. This panel here has a few other things that are wrong with it, and I'd like to point those out to you. Down here you can see a line that goes across. If you look real closely, you'll see the swirl marks, and that's from an orbital sander. And you remember I told you about the swirl marks it makes. That's exactly what's happened here. It's swirled across. Now, I could go back and sand that out. It's on the back of the door, so I probably won't. But it's one of those things that would be very embarrassing if it were on the front, and it wouldn't be something I'd look forward to showing. I would probably sand it out. Over here you can see that the grain is kind of wild, and the orientation of the grain actually exposed more end grain to the surface, which absorbed more of the pigments, and that gave us a little bit different color match. Now, if we look at the opposite side, we see the color is really quite good, although we did have a little pigment bleed in there. I'm not really concerned about that because I think it'll come out as I put the first coat of finish on. It'll tend to float those away. Other than that, I'm pretty pleased with the way this one came out. Now, that was a pigment stain. Remember, we used the water dye stain on here, and there's a couple things that I'm going to have to address and deal with. One of them is I want you to take a look at these holes here in the front. These were filled with a regular colored wood filler. That it was the same color as the wood. I hadn't planned on using the dye stain, and I really didn't know the behavior, but what has happened is they are very obvious instead of being hidden. So I might be able to take a marker, like a furniture marker that has some color, and kind of color that in, and that's what I'll try to do. But next time were I to do this, I would want to make sure I used a plastic wood filler that had the same colorant as the desired outcome finish, that is the final or target color. As you look inside the cabinet from about this angle, you'll see that I've got to touch up the stain in here. I've got some lap marks where I need to darken up that bottom a little bit, and with a dye stain I can actually do that, and I'm going to go back and touch that in. Other than that, I'm quite pleased with the way it looks. It didn't raise the grain very much at all, so I'm real happy with that. I'll put the sanding sealer on and proceed, and you'll see that in my next video on finishing. I want you to now look at this cabinet, and you'll remember that we used the gelled wood stain here. And look at the front of this cabinet and the moldings. The colors are all real uniform, and that's one of the characteristics of using the gelled wood stains. They tend to blend nicely. They'll cover most things. There's a lot of forgiveness in them, and that's one of the reasons I like to use them. Now, up here at the top, there's a couple of things to look at. Over here, and it's very small, is a slight glue blemish that didn't get cleaned up. The glue actually oozed out of the joint and wasn't cleaned off, so it's a little lighter. It's not very obvious, and I'll probably live with that. There's a slight opening there, and I will cover that in later with one of those wax crayons I showed you earlier, but that'll be after finishing. Over here on this side, you can see a couple scratch marks here where we over sanded that way. So it's not too bad a job, but there's still a little bit that could be done with it, and I'm going to just see what I can do to kind of touch that up. Now, as we go over here to the end of this cabinet, we see a few things that are interesting. First of all, again, a pigmenting stain. The color is real nice on the plywood, except the base molding is much lighter. They didn't take the stain quite uniformly. There may have been some sanding differences, or it may just be the grain orientation of the wood. With a rotary cut plywood, there's a lot more end grain that can pick up the pigments in the stain, whereas this flat sawn has less of the grain exposed, or the open grain, so it doesn't pick up quite as much pigment. What could I do here? I could use a toner stain over this to darken it up to call attention to it, and that might be an approach to use. Now, up here at the front, we cut a detail line so that we could kind of minimize the difference in contrast. We've called your attention to that line there, and the line is actually darker. But unfortunately, it was a glue joint. You can see that we didn't quite get all the glue. I don't know if you can see it well, but right over here is a slight blemish of glue that is going to be there forever. The pigments couldn't go into that, so it resisted the penetration. I can take a marker again and just kind of darken over that and hide it, and that's what I'll be inclined to do. Other than that, the color on this is very good. I'm happy with everything that I see, and I'm going to proceed to do some finishing in the next tape. Well, as you can see, there are a number of details to be concerned with in wood finishing. A couple resources that I'd like to recommend to you. One is Understanding Wood Finishing by Bob Flexner. It's probably one of the most modern and current books on the subject. It's available at leading bookstores and through Rodale Publishing. Another book is my book, Woodworking Principles and Practices. This has a wealth of information on surface preparation that will be beneficial to you, and also a complete breakdown of all of the qualities of stains that you've seen in this video. If you're interested in this book, it's available as Woodworking Principles and Practices in hardbound, or the Woodworker's Handbook in a softbound. Also, I want to go back now and remind you of a few things that we've covered. First of all, protect your hands one way or another with plastic gloves or rubber gloves, and put some cleaner on them so they clean up easily. Also, be thinking about your surface preparation. Do all your machine sanding and then hand sand. Make sure you get a good job before you even think about staining. Try the stain on a scrap. Try it over some wood filler. See what you can learn before you take the plunge, because otherwise you're going to come back with some of this touch-up to work to do. The more you learn early, the better it's going to be. So I would urge you to think about those things. Finally, I want to tell you that there are a number of other videos in the series. There's also one on finishing, applying top coats, called Rubbing and Polishing the Cabinet, and that's also available. And until next time, I want to thank you for watching and remind you, if you want to be a better woodworker, you got to do more woodworking. I hope to see you on another tape.